filling boxes in, if you ever did it in grade school, you were actually doing pre-algebra. You were filling in boxes. The symbol stood in for something. You could put 2 plus what equals 7. The question mark stands in or takes the place of a number until that. In algebra, sometimes we never find the number, but the whole purpose of algebra is to eventually use a formula to find numbers. We do a lot of skill building before we get to it. All right? And generally, we don't use this symbol or we don't use this symbol. We generally use like N, or we generally use like X. You guys always complain of X's and Y's, but that's what it is. For a while, you have an unknown number.
The box was just so much more friendly.
I know. That's what friendly is. All right. Now, the reason we start using letters is because you start getting into formulas. What's that? Oh, that's not there.
Distance is equal to rate times time.
Distance is equal to rate times time. Here we go. We'll do one that we do know. What's that? Interest is equal to
Percent times the rate.
principal times rate times. Okay. So we start using letters because they start having meaning. They stand in for not only numbers, but they stand in for like words. Principal P. Okay? A variable expression is a mathematical phrase that contains at least one variable. Alright, this, anytime you start doing times, multiply, divide, add, whatever, that's a mathematical phrase. That's a mathematical phrase. You have multiple things. This says 1 and 3. Find the sum of 1 and 3. Just like in English when you have a phrase, 1 and 3. Math, that's what you're doing. Is you're finding the product, the difference, the quotient, etc., etc. That's a phrase. When you put a variable in there, then you have a variable phrase or expression. So if I did like 1 plus x or 1 times x, then I to evaluate an expression or evaluating an expression, finding the value of a variable expression by replacing the variable. Alright, so all you got to know is that an expression basically contains operations, and you got to follow the order of operations if you're going to simplify. You have operations in there. If it's a variable expression, it has operations, but there's also a variable. Or I'm going to put an S on it. Variable or variables only. Here's a variable expression, 1 plus x. 1 times x is a variable expression. X plus y is a variable expression. X plus y plus 3 is still a variable expression. X squared minus 2x plus 3 is still a variable expression. Because you have operations with a variable involved. Now, to evaluate that, if it's just an expression, right now you will not see an equal sign. In all of these expressions that I have up here, do you see an equal sign? No. Therefore, you cannot find the value of this until something happens. And what does it say has to happen? It says, to find the value, you replace each variable with a given value. So in other words, the book or I or somebody has to give you a value for the variable. So I would say evaluate x plus y when x equals 2 and y equals -8. So I give you the values that I want you to put in there. And literally then what you're going to do is you're going to replace the x with 2. And you're going to replace the y with, and you're going to do 2 plus -8, which is, so x plus y is -6 when x is 2 and y is -8. Now those are just random values that the book gives you or that I choose. That's evaluating an expression. You have to have it. Take the interest equals principal times rate times time. When I write PRT, what does that mean? It means multiplication. You've got to remember that. Just like distance equals rate times time. It's multiplication. If I have principal times rate times time, I have to give you principal, rate, and time before you can do that part of it, right? So I would give you P is 5,000, R is 10%, and time is like 5. I have to give you values before you can evaluate principal times rate times time. I just want you to make sure that you know that that's PRT. If I put x, y minus z up here, tell me what that means. Tell me what x, y minus z means. X times y minus z. Okay, you've got to understand that that's a time. The next thing you got to understand is that if I put x up there, how many is it? It's 1x. This is the same thing. You've got to understand that if I put x by itself, that really means 1 times x. If you put negative x up here, that really means -1 times x. So those are 2 things you got to know for any variable, not just x. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. I don't like the name. Alright, so is there any questions about the first 3 things? A variable expression, or evaluating the expression? Alright, the next thing you have is a term. You gotta understand what a term is.
Product of a number.
If you put a number up there on the board, that's a single term. Now notice I got term, I don't have plural terms yet, right? A number is a term. A variable is a term. So if I stick X up there. So here's some terms. -1/2, 3, 769, X, -Y, A. Those are all single terms. And it says that it's a product of a number and one or more variables. A number and variable or variables. Or in other words, if I put -1/2 X up here, that means it's understood to be a product. It's understood that you're multiplying. If I put 3Y up there, if I put 769AX up there, it's still all a product. You're still multiplying. It's still a term. One. -3XY, that's still a single term. So now, how do you get terms? Terms are separated by addition or subtraction. So if I have X plus 1 up there, this is a term and this is a term. They are separated by a, so you have how many terms? 2. And that one that I had before, like 3x squared plus 2x plus 8, how many terms is that? That's 3 terms. This term, and this term. You have a variable term, and new word. Instead of saying a number term, it's called a constant term. A number is always constant. The number 5 has a value of 5. It's not going to change. It's not all of a sudden going to become like 5.1. Right? It's 5. So that's a constant. Because if it was 2x squared plus 2x minus 8, it's still -8. Its value is never going to change. Anything with a variable in it is called a variable term. So that's a variable term, that's a variable term, and that's a constant term. Variable at this point in time just means that it can vary. Right now, there's any number that can go in there. You can put any number in for X. Now, I'm going to tell you numbers, or eventually you're going to find numbers that make true statements. Any questions about that? So any number that is a term is going to be called a constant term. This is where it gets, you got to keep all this stuff straight.
So even if it's a -8, it's still considered a constant?
Yes,
Right?
right, because -8 will never change.
Okay.
It's still -8. It won't vary. Variable means it varies, constant means it doesn't vary. A number will never vary. It's -3 is -3, it never changes.